to remember what he stood for. And even people like James Cone, who were inspired by him and Malcolm X and the people of the civil rights movement, for us to think deeply what it means for us to fight for liberty and justice for all of God's people. Please pray with me. Gracious God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day. We pray, oh God, that you will open up our hearts and our minds to receive what you have to say to us today through this panel, conversation, discussion. We pray, oh God, that we will not just hear what is said today, but God, that you will move us to action, that you will help us to be people who look to transform your world, not just with our words, but also with our hands and our feet and our voice. That's right. We thank you, God, for the food that we have received. We thank you for the hands that prepared it. May all of us be nourished, be strengthened, be encouraged today to go out to seek justice and to love our neighbors as ourselves. We pray in the name of Christ Jesus. Amen. Amen.
First, allow me to say thank you to Reverend Cynthia Lee and to all those who helped make today's event possible. I, too, want to welcome you to this panel discussion on race and poverty in America, 50 years after MLK, presented by the FaithJustice Foundation and hosted here at Annandale United Methodist Church. I want to just let you know that FaithJustice is a new nonprofit. We are officially incorporated here in Virginia. We, as I mentioned previously, received a grant from the General Commission on Religion and Race. And one of our first brilliant decisions was to bring on Reverend Cynthia Lee as Director of Programs for this organization. So we are excited. We're also on Facebook Live today, so this program is being live streamed on our Facebook page, which is also relatively new. And if you haven't had a chance, this will be a great day to like us at FaithJustice Found. And if you want to comment, using the hashtag MLK50 and hashtag FaithJustice. So earlier this month, numerous events were held to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. This milestone allowed us to pause and reflect on his legacy, but also to assess where we are 50 years later. So when we think about 50 years from Dr. King's passing, we also have to be reminded that we're 50 years from the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis that led him there on that fateful day. 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign and the Poor People's March on Washington, which reflected sort of a turn in the movement that King organized toward the end of his life, and it was carried on by members of his team. 50 years from those deadly riots that broke out following his death. And of special significance today as well, 50 years after the report of the Kerner Commission, which convened to call the reasons of violence and civil unrest in the 1967 riots. I fear today that there might be a misperception after 50 years. We've witnessed unimaginable, at least to our parents and grandparents, unimaginable successes by African Americans in sports, in entertainment, television, and the big screen, science, technology, business, academia, a variety of sectors, and even in the highest political office of our land. African Americans, in absolute terms, have made progress, and that have a college degree. And these inequalities begin at a young age. More than a third of African American children attend schools that are less than 10% white and disproportionately low income. After all that work on desegregation, that is the state of public education today. 7.5% of African Americans were unemployed in 2017, compared to 6.7% in 1968, but still roughly twice the unemployment rate. The rate of home ownership, the American dream of pulling yourself up, has remained, for the most part, unchanged in 50 years. And perhaps most troubling of all, the share of incarcerated African Americans has nearly tripled between 1968 and 2016. African Americans are 6.4 times as likely to be jailed or in prison. Fred Harris, and he's the sole surviving member of the Kerner Commission, says that whereas the Kerner Commission called for massive and sustained investment in economic, employment, and education initiatives, over the last 50 years, America has pursued massive and sustained incarceration, framed as law and order. Now, as I mentioned, the Kerner Commission convened to explore the cause of violence and rioting that erupted in 1967. And they found, and the report was issued in 1968, 50 years ago, and they found that it was due to stark economic inequalities. But I wonder if today we should remember another king. On April 29, 1992, 26 years ago today, rioting broke out again on American streets when 4 officers were acquitted in the videotaped beating of Rodney King, exposing long-standing injustices and lack of accountability in criminal law enforcement. Or maybe we should think about April 29, 2015, when riots once again broke out, not too far from here in Baltimore, Maryland, over the fatal mistreatment of Freddie Gray at the hands of Baltimore police. One of the most poignant conclusions of the Kerner Commission was the point that had we addressed racial and economic inequality in 1990, after a similar commission analyzed the Chicago riots, just maybe we would have made some progress. Where do we want to be 25, 50 years from now? I think today's April 29th panel is of such importance because every social justice issue we consider, from food insecurity, hunger, education, mass incarceration, healthcare, intersectional gender inequality, violence, and civil unrest, all seem to meet at the intersection of race and poverty in America. And so today we have a distinguished panel assembled to comment on these. And I would ask you to join me in welcoming at this time Marlysa Gamblin, who is the Domestic Advisor for Policy and Program for Bread for the World, where she provides research and analysis to end hunger and poverty among low-income African Americans. I'll read their bios for our purposes here, but you can find out more about them on our website. We'll also hear from Reverend Michelle Letter, who serves as Director of Program Ministries at the United Methodist General Commission on Religion and Race, where she works to help all levels of the connection to create a beloved community with systems, policies, and processes that level the playing field for everyone, and to further diversity, inclusion, and equity within the church. And also Reverend Dr. Asa Lee, who is Associate Dean for Community Life at Wesley Theological Seminary, where he is responsible for programmatic, academic, and spiritual life of seminary students. Please join me in welcoming this panel.
Hi everyone, how are folks doing? Excited? You're fed?
For folks on Facebook Live, sorry, you're gonna have to get your own food. It was good though. When I was asked to speak on the panel, I was asked to speak on a very, very specific question that I'm going to answer. And the question is essentially around what has changed in the last 50 years. Since the assassination of Martin Luther King, since the Kerner Commission report, and since the Poor People's Campaign, all happening literally 50 years ago. That's a really, really long answer. It's something that folks could probably spend a lifetime researching, and even a year studying at school. But I'm gonna do my best to condense it to the 10 minutes that I was given. Amen? Okay, so I wanna start off by saying that this is not everything, but it's a condensed version of things. It's really, I wanna give a comprehensive landscape of things in terms of some things that have kind of improved, other things that have generally stayed the same, and then things that have gotten worse, just so that we can have an overall appreciation of everything looking holistically. Does that sound good? Awesome. So some of the things I think Cynthia actually pointed out around, politically, there have been more opportunities. I think with the election of Barack Obama, that's clearly an improvement. That's not necessarily something I think we would have seen 50 years ago. But I would say this. I think that with that, we've also seen an increase in the integration of public spaces. And I want to say public and not private, because that's a very intentional thing. And when you look at private spaces, we know that those have been even more segregated than they were 40 years ago. And depending on how you disaggregate what public means, that's also the case as well. But without getting wonky on you, generally speaking, when we're in the supermarket, or we can go out to eat, or there's public transit, generally speaking, things are more integrated, and not necessarily accessible, but integrated, because those are two different things. I think as a result, unfortunately, that's given us this facade that for whatever reason, we as a country have made it, and we just honestly have not. I'll get to that shortly, though. One of the other things that have actually improved, though, as Cynthia was saying, is actually related to education. In the 1960s, unfortunately, just education for all of America was just not where it needed to be. And we're getting onto the track right now, but we still need to make a lot of improvements in comparison to the other countries. But I say that because I think the graduation rate for whites was like 40%, and then the graduation rate for blacks was 20%. And they don't have the data for Latinos. They don't actually get the data until like 1970. So you see that it's essentially half the, that whites are graduating double the rate of blacks. That's recently closed. It's only a few percentage points apart, so that's closed. That's at the high school level. So that's really good. I think we can be really excited for that. There's also just a lot of other things in that I won't get into on, even though we see that is closed, it doesn't necessarily mean it's equitable, because you still have a higher instance of not necessarily having the same quality education, and that's as a result of a lot of structurally racist housing policies that then funnel unfortunate and unequal and unequitable education systems that we see today. But that's another topic. What unfortunately we don't see is that same closing of the rate when we get to college level education. And I think some of this actually has to do with just basic wealth. So back in like the 1940s, you see a lot of African Americans actually really wanting to go to college and applying to colleges, but not getting accepted into all white institutions, and therefore being waitlisted on HBCUs. At one point in time, blacks were actually, there were I think 20,000 African Americans who were just on wait lists at HBCUs. So that tells you that the desire to go to college was always there, but now there's just access to go to college. So in actual numbers, you see more blacks going to college now, and it's not necessarily because, now black students want to go to college, but it's as a result of, now they're getting accepted, and now there's more access more broadly, to make that possible. But the reason that we see the gap still is because of basic wealth. As a result of the racial wealth divide between whites and blacks, you actually see an increase in the ability of white households being able to send their children off to pay for other asset building opportunities such as college, whereas you don't necessarily see that for black families. At the same time that you see a lot of black students who are funneling into going into college and so on and so forth, not having the same financial backing and therefore having a lot of debt in comparison to their white counterparts, and at the same time being met with racial discrimination post-college when they're trying to seek employment opportunities. So then that only complicates and kind of sustains what we saw 50 years ago with employment discrimination and so on and so forth. So even though things are integrated, we still have a ton of work to do. Now let's get to what stayed the same. A lot of things have stayed the same. Hunger levels, food insecurity levels, poverty levels, those have stayed the same in terms of rates, where blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, they're all twice as likely to experience hunger and poverty as whites. And that was honestly how it was during the Great Depression as well. So you see the continuance, rather, of the same issue that we've had for over 100 years, you can say. But unfortunately, there has not really been a response to the recommendations of the Kerner report has really kind of lifted up to address structural poverty and so on and so forth. So that's really, really unfortunate. At the same time, you have unemployment. Blacks are still, and Latino, blacks and other communities of color more broadly are generally around 2 times as likely to be unemployed or even underemployed as their white counterparts. We saw that again dating back to the Great Depression, again at 50 years ago, and then again today. So that has not changed. At the same time that you have things like over-policing, which is not necessarily over-policing, let me back off for a minute, where you have things like the devaluation of black and brown bodies not changing. So we know that our country has an intimate, has a strong intimacy with violence against black and brown bodies. And we know that to be the case from the early days against Native Americans, that transitioned to slavery against African Americans, and then it later transitioned into the criminal justice system that we currently have with over-policing and the over-incarcerating of black and brown bodies. And this is something, again, that with the over-policing part and the over-incarcerating part, this is something that actually didn't start before, this didn't start after slavery. It actually started before slavery. So remember, there were freed blacks in the North. And it's interesting because I'll give you an example. In Pennsylvania, blacks only represented about 2.3% of the population, but they were 15% of those who were actually incarcerated. That tells us that blacks were not necessarily committing crime at a higher rate, but more so over-policed at 7 times their population size. And that was before the Emancipation Proclamation. That tells us a lot. We see the continuation of that throughout time, and even when we're thinking about it 50 years ago, then you still see the overcurrents, let's say, of black and brown bodies being over-policed, but the sheer number of that has increased exponentially. From 1970 until about the early 2000s, we actually see our incarceration population actually increasing by 700% just from state population growth alone. Let me repeat that, 700% just by state population growth alone. That's a lot. And we know that that blacks actually can be up to 10 times as likely. So the number that Cynthia gave does not actually disaggregate folks by race, and look, it doesn't actually disaggregate it by state. When you're actually getting on the state level, because that's essentially where a lot of the surge was, then you're actually going to get even a higher number. So in about 12 states, blacks are actually 10 times as likely as their white counterparts to be incarcerated and sentenced. That's a lot. And unfortunately, we see that surge just increasing. And at the same time that we see a lot of, unfortunately, that tearing apart black wealth, tearing apart the opportunities for a lot of black men in particular to essentially reintegrate, get jobs, fight hunger, fight poverty, at the same time that it's tearing apart and undermining the black family. So those are some of the things I think have kind of stayed the same, but then when it comes to incarceration, that has actually worsened. When it comes to another thing that's worsened, when we're thinking about schools, it's great that in the beginning I mentioned, oh yes, we've been able to grow in one sense. The fact that we have kind of narrowed the graduation rate, right? But when we think about the fact, when we think about schools and the fact that, yes, they have integration, unfortunately, however, schools are more segregated today than they were 40 years ago. And that's just a fact. There's a ton of research on that, and that's not encouraging, right? We know that a lot of the reason for that is just because of lack of enforcement and actually a response to the integration. So let me go ahead and share one thing. Part of the lack of enforcement actually comes from our federal government, as we know. The IRS, for example, continue to provide funds to public entities, public and private entities that were receiving federal dollars, who still identified and still practice segregation. And they didn't start pulling funds away until the 1970s. This is 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education. But this is also a little over 10 years, we should say, after discrimination actually became an illegal thing. So it's just something to kind of think about when we're thinking about, okay, well, this is our reality, but why is it? It's really as a result of a lack of enforcement of policy that was intended to have a particular impact that was never actually able to have that impact realized. So I don't want to necessarily go on too much. I do have remarks for policy, but maybe we can come back to that. Okay, awesome.
Great. Greetings, everybody. I was asked to come here as part of my work with the General Commission on Religion and Race, which has already been stated is the commission, the group that's been set aside by the United Methodist Church to help interrogate and dismantle racism that happens within the church. Sometimes what happens is it's easier to look outside of organizations or communities that we are a part of and say, yes, this is what's going wrong out here, but the G-Corps is helping the United Methodist Church take an internal look and see where racism exists there and then interrupt and dismantle that through a number of methods. So I was asked to come here to consider the 50 years since Martin Luther King through the lens of institutional equity, which is the area that I focus on at G-Corps, and under which anti-racism work functions for our organization. So I'll just start with a couple of comments, and then what I'd like to do is just give a kind of horizon view of a couple of things that we talk about in workshops with churches within a denomination that is predominantly white in the United States. So for the United Methodist Church, the low number is that there is at least 90% white folks in U.S. churches. Some go all the way up to 99+%. So that will tell you how the United States United Methodist Church is skewing racially. So again, I'm just going to start with some general remarks that come from my own kind of sense of myself within this 50 years, and then I'll move to some of the things we talk about in workshops that help churches move toward institutional racial justice and racial equity, and then maybe the questions that come afterwards would flesh out anything that you wanted to focus on. I was born 380 days after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In this way, my life represents at least one version of white people 50 years since Dr. King's legacy began. As a white woman who was born in 1969, I lived a life that did not require me to think about race. I grew up being taught the lie that being colorblind created racial equality, and that it was normal that the only black kids I knew were those who were bused in from the inner city to my suburban schools. I grew up without reading books by or even about people of color, and was never challenged by my teachers, my parents, or my peers to do otherwise. Even though I didn't become a person of faith until my mid-20s, my work on the General Commission on Religion and Race and my interactions with multitudes of people who were brought up in the church has taught me that just being taught about the love of Jesus, even entering into a relationship with God in a saving way, has not been connected to racial justice or racial equity for most white people. Many white Christians are unable to quote Dr. King's work, and when we do, we limit our scope to those quotes which can easily be whitewashed into comfort food for our white souls. Quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers," conveniently covering over and skipping over the comment about racist Alabama. And quote, "I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. With this faith, we'll be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day," end quote. But easily, even if subconsciously, forget to add the parts of speech which call out the viciousness of racism and the part that white people play in sustaining and protecting it. Quote, from the letter from that jail that time. "You deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place on the football field. I mean Birmingham. But I am sorry to say that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being." Quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation." Quote, "I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the black man's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to the positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the black man to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from the people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection, end quote. I name these particular quotes because in the work that I do at G-Corps, I often come across people who proclaim with their mouth that they want racial justice and racial equity. Some which would even go so far as to say we want racial justice and racial equity at any cost. But many times in the white dominant churches that I visit, even invited into to do these workshops, the pushback comes when institutional equity is at stake. So when it goes past building relationships, and when it goes past having conversations, and when it goes past spending time where those of us who are white will process all of the guilt and shame that honestly we should feel over racism, then it's gone too far. So I want to talk about some of the things that can actually interrupt and dismantle racism at the institutional equity level for churches. One is we need to move beyond just awareness to action. So when I say things like those of us who are white need to process all of our feelings and all of the things that we're going through as we gain increased awareness, I'm not saying that awareness isn't important. In fact, it's critical. It's critical for us to do that work. But let us not be fooled into the lie that we should invite communities of color into that space to hold our hands while we do it. Institutional equity says that we shall do our own work, and then we will come together and learn how we can do it faithfully and tangibly in ways that are meaningful for the folks that are direct targets of racism. Otherwise, our words are just words, and we're just recreating racist systems where white people are centered and cared for. The other thing is that there's a distinct difference between equality and equity. So many times, especially in the church, this comes from great teachings about fairness and justice and things like that. Equality is actually when everything is split apart as equal, offered as equal, worked as equal, and this fits right into our understanding of we are all equal under God. We've all been created in the image of God. But when it comes to institutional equity, equality can actually foster and generate more inequality. So let me just give a quick example. If one child has 2 blocks, like building blocks, and another child has 5 building blocks, and you give each child 5 building blocks, the first child now has 7, 2 plus 5, 7, and the second child who starts with 5 has 10, right? So if you continue to offer blocks with the equality model, you continue to perpetuate and protect the inequality that's already there. Equity says that we must adjust and we must make up for. So if nothing else, equality means adjust and make up for. I can go into kind of specifics of that, specific exercises that we do, but I'll move on. There's also something called what I call the 5 whys. So many times I'll go into a church and they'll say, we would love to be more diverse here, right? In the generalized kind of sense. We'd love to be more diverse. But when we look around, we only see people who look like us. So one strategy of institutional equity is to ask why. Why? Oh, because people in our neighborhood only look like us. Oh, why? That's number 2. Right? And as you get, especially as you get toward the 4th and 5th why, now we have to uncover the things that are grounding this segregated living and worshiping together. The other one is, let me see, where am I? 4th. The 4th one is, where's the money? So I think it was back in the 80s, there was an older white woman who was the pitch person for Wendy's, I think, and she said, where's the beef? In institutional equity, ask the question, where's the money? I'm just going to say, thinking about money in banking. Every church has a bank account. Where is that banking being done? Is it being done with a bank that has had studies now come out and show research that shows that there have been inequitable and unjust racial policies or policies according to race? Or is that money placed into a black-owned bank or a bank owned by people of color, right? Every church should be asking that question. How about your budget? Where is the money going? How many efforts toward racial justice and racial equity actually have money behind them? If you took your budget and you figured out each area that directly affected the interruption or disruption of racism within your church or within your conference, and you figured out what percent that was of your total budget, what would that be? For annual conferences, is there any accountability for churches that aren't doing tangible, meaningful, and powerful work for racial justice and racial equity, where you give up some of your budget as the cost of not doing this critical, necessary, important work? And boards, for those of us who are in organizations that have boards of directors, and we are intentionally, white dominant boards that are intentionally asking people of color to come, and one, to help us diversify our white dominant boards, and two, to help those of us who are white find our own blind spots as it relates to racism. Are we paying those people for their intellectual and emotional labor? Right? These are very real, where's the beef kind of questions that often get looked over or cast off when we're so focused on conversations and processing and relationships. What we don't realize is that processing and relationships and conversations can't happen in faithful and meaningful ways if these underlying inequities aren't addressed. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because we only have a couple of minutes for an introduction. But as we get to the questions and the answers, I'm more than happy to flesh out anything that I've said, or even touch back with you about something that has come up for you in those comments. So thank you very much for your time.
Good afternoon. I want to, I've been charged as the seminary professor in the room to speak a bit about what these 50 years mean for ministerial preparation of the future of the church. In my other capacity, I serve also as the Director of African American Church Studies at Wesley Seminary, and this semester in particular, we've had the opportunity to sojourn to Memphis in February. In fact, a week and a half after the start of the strike 50 years ago, we were present and actually heard from the surviving persons who were the sanitation workers there. So in good, and I'm also Baptist, which means I have 3 points. And or him, yes. But I think there are 3 distinct ways we can draw meaning. And the first is that there are some key lessons to learn about the Memphis sanitation workers strike. Most of us outside of the city of Memphis understand the sanitation workers strike to be the occasion by which Dr. King was assassinated. However, in hearing from and walking and speaking to the living history that was present in Memphis, there was a real movement happening there. And the lesson from the Memphis sanitation workers strike is that there is an intersection between civil rights, economic rights, and human dignity. And let me just offer you, this comes from a wonderful book, and if you don't have it, you need to get it, especially if you're a student of history. Going Down Jericho Road, The Memphis Strike, Martin Luther King's Last Campaign, by historian Michael K. Honey. He opens the book with, I'm just going to read a little bit of it, that highlights the level of indignity that was present in Memphis in the 1960s as it relates to public servants, trash workers. At the end of a miserable cold workday, Echo Cole, 36, and Robert Walker, 30, have their soiled, worn-out clothes smelling of garbage, for the city did not provide them gloves, uniforms, or a place to shower. They did hard, heavy work, lifting garbage tubs and carrying them on their shoulders or heads or push carts to dump their contents into outmoded, broken-down trucks. On this particular day, Cole and Walker rode in a precarious, stinky perch between a hydraulic ram used to mash garbage into a small wad and the wall of the truck's cavernous container. So they're inside the container of the truck. Between the ram, you've seen the ram on garbage trucks that crushes the garbage. They're in a space between that because there was no way to sit them in, they weren't allowed to sit inside the cab. As Crew Chief Willie Crane drove the loaded garbage packer along Colonial Street to the Shelby Drive dump, he heard the hydraulic ram go into action. Perhaps set off by a shovel that had jarred loose and crossed some electrical wires, he pulled the truck over to the curb at 4:20 p.m., but the ram already was jamming Cole and Walker back into the compaction. One of the men lurched forward and nearly escaped, but the ram snagged his raincoat and dragged him back. One horrified woman who saw what happened said he was standing there on the end of the truck and suddenly it looked like the big thing just swallowed him whole. Cole and Walker died that day. That was February 1st, 1968. Those deaths highlighted for the city and for the sanitation workers the lack of care for these public servants. Some quick statistics about Memphis in 1968. It was 40% African American, but 58% of those African Americans lived in poverty, at or below the poverty level. The average sanitation worker's salary was 96 cents an hour. By the time the strike was in full mode, the rate of pay was $1.80 an hour, 20 cents below the federal poverty level. One man, Ed Gillis, who had been working for 20 years as a sanitation worker, made $7.80 a day. They were called to haul 50-pound plus tubs of garbage in the rain, sleet, snow, and flooding weather of Memphis, Tennessee, sweltering weather of Tennessee. What we learned from Memphis is that the strike was not about money. It was about dignity. That these were human beings that the city was counting on to take their trash. 96% of the staff of the DPW, of the garbage workers themselves, were African American because whites did not want to do it. The whites did the hiring and they managed the shops and the bus barns, but blacks went out and took care of the trash. No one paid attention to them, but no one bothered to listen to their cries. And so what I learned from an individual like Bill Lucy was the first person on the scene after the death of the sanitation workers from the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, otherwise known as AFSCME, which took the lead in the actual strike. But we were able to sit and talk to Bill Lucy at length. And he told us about how they came up with I Am a Man, that iconic symbol of the strike. It was because the sanitation workers overwhelmingly weren't talking about money. They were talking about, do they see me? And for us in theological education and as Christians, this is the most important element of what I believe is the witness of the gospel. That if Jesus Christ became human, then surely part of our responsibility is to see one another's humanity in its fullness. And the struggle we have in the church is that we don't want our Jesus to be human. That's why we don't come to Good Friday services, by and large. Maybe not in Annandale, but in other places. We struggle with humanity. So if we can't look on at Jesus who is dying on a cross, we certainly can't look at Michael Brown laying in the street, or Freddie Gray being tossed around in the back of a van, or garbage workers who get killed in the back of a truck. There are lessons there, that there's intersectionality between civil rights, class distinctions, and human dignity. A second lesson that we would take away is that from the Kerner Commission itself, the most controversial line in the entire 600-page report was the statement from the report that white racism is, quote, white racism is essentially responsible for the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II, end quote. It was a reality. Johnson had the whole thing, President Johnson had the whole thing trashed. But the reality is that the statement still holds true to this day. And I would add to that, from the church perspective, that we as the Christian church, particularly white Christian, white Protestantism, must also come to grips with the reality that the white racism that has gripped our society has been perpetuated by Christianity, white Christianity in America. It's a hard thing to come to grips with. But the truth of the matter is that most white churches, regardless of denomination, I know we like to pick on the Southern Baptists all the time, but regardless of denomination, participated in and in many cases supported segregationist practices. I have to remind Methodists that one of the signers to Dr. King, to which Dr. King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail, was a United Methodist bishop, to which Dr. King was speaking against. And so what we must do as the Christian church is that if we participated in building it, we must also participate in dismantling it. And the people who are the descendants of the builders must be willing to participate in its dismantling. And that is the part and ownership, and this may sound weird, that is the grace of God. That God gives us another chance to get it right. And the grace of God is always difficult for everybody to receive. But it's our responsibility to be able to do that. The last thing I would say is that the movement that comes from the death of Dr. King and subsequently from the intersectionality of the strike itself is that we must diversify our dialogue about God. That there has to be a distinctiveness in our theological discourse. From the academy side, our charge is to equip, prepare, and here's the hard part, push our mother church to be its best self from the thinking side. If God said to love God, if Jesus said that we are to love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul, then theology is loving God with your mind. That's one of the quotes from Dr. James Cone, who we heard from earlier. Theology is loving God with your mind. And the seminary, the theological school, is the place where we seek to teach you to do that better. And our love needs to be diversified. That means being willing to explore theologies and beliefs and practices that challenge our own. The discourse of black theology, of liberation theology, of womanist and feminist theology, while they all have their particular slants and purposes, they ultimately seek to reflect on the distinctiveness of Jesus Christ. And while the traditional area of theology was with white Germans mostly in the 19th century and early 20th century, the idea of liberational movements is to push that and say, we're not just thinking about the work of Christ, but the body of Christ. That if God could be incarnated as anything, God chose to be a first century Palestinian Jew under Roman oppression. What does that mean? That's the purpose of liberation theology. And so, James Cone, for example, would say it means that God is a God who always sides with the oppressed. And being a Christian means we should be always looking for the oppressed and siding with them. Other theologians have different perspectives about that, but I say this to say that in a time in which we bristle against distinctiveness, Black Lives Matter or Me Too, the distinctiveness of these are not negations of someone else, but it's a call to the distinctiveness of Jesus being who Jesus is in our life. That God chose a distinctive body, a distinctive time, a distinctive place, right? So that when we go into the world, all of us, we have our own distinctions, our own particularities. Those aren't meant to be degradations of something else, but instead are calling us to be attentive to what God is doing in that community, in that place, at this particular time. That's our struggle. That's the lesson here. That's what we have to carry forward. And frankly, it's the historical charge of our ancestors, regardless of ethnicity. What will we do with what we've been passed down? And so I leave you with that. There's more to be said, but certainly we want to have time for discussion. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I want to offer a brief interlude and share that part of the mission of the FaithJustice Foundation and our next big effort that we're going to launch is called Social Justice Summer. And we'll be inviting congregations throughout the region and across the country, really, to a national conversation on social justice that they can participate in by offering a sermon series, a book study, small group discussion, and at least one social justice action that they can do during the summer to move this conversation and this effort forward. And you can find out more on our website. But I want to tie that in, particularly that last part, in terms of social justice action. When I think about 50 years ago, when I think about the Civil Rights Movement, when I think about that iconic walk across the Pettus Bridge, I think about how people of faith were at the forefront of this, that people of faith were putting their lives on the line for something that mattered, something that could make a significant difference for many people, in many people's lives and in the lives of our nation. And I think about how my observation is that many churches are willing to engage in what we call mercy ministry. Meeting immediate needs such as food and clothing. And that's important. That's critical for many people. But how do we call church? What concrete things, and this is a question for our panelists, what is at least one concrete thing that a church could do to move forward in terms of social justice on this issue of race and poverty in America?
So that's also a question that deserves probably like a year-long dissertation. I think, so for me it goes back to policy. So I focus on public policy, and so does Bread for the World. We look at federal policy, although I do think it's important to just look at kind of policy in general. You have local, you have state, and you have federal. And I really appreciate your distinguishment of equity versus equality. Equity is important, and it's important that we pursue racial equity in order to receive a level of equality in terms of outcomes. We want equal outcomes, but the only way that we can do that is not necessarily by equal inputs, but instead by equitable inputs that are probably most likely in the form of targeted investments. So the way that I look at this is kind of three different panels. You have the hunger panel, which is essentially like people are in extreme levels of food insecurity and they need something now. Those policies, I think, include SNAP, making sure that that things are not cut. There are a lot of, unfortunately, attacks against that, and quite seriously, we actually need to strengthen as opposed to weaken programs like that. We also need to make sure that those programs have a racial equity lens, because right now they don't. In addition to kind of some of the things that might fall under kind of the immediate things that families need, particularly people of color who have suffered under the regime of racism need, in particular, include things like Medicare, WIC, access to after-school programs, nutrition programs for children, all of these kind of like immediate things. But the thing is that that's not the only thing, and that's not going to get us where we need to go. But we need to protect these programs, strengthen them, and actually apply a racial equity lens that actually says, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't say work requirements, because even though we know that seemingly it sounds good, right? It's equal, right? People should work. We know that there's a systematic attack against Black workers being able to enter into the spaces by which they're able to be employed. And when they are employed, they're underemployed. And we also know that that people of color in particular are actually overrepresented in the 10 lowest paying occupations in the United States. Some of which actually include people that can make as low as $2.13 an hour without benefits. I did the math, and even for something that's minimum wage, I mean, you'd have to work at least like 120 hours. I don't know about you, but that's crazy. Right. And then when you take into account, okay, you could make as low as $2.13, that's more than 120 hours. Who has the time? It's absolutely crazy. Then you get to the structural barriers, and I think the reason why I'm separating it into three is because the church, I think it's important to pray for discernment on kind of corporately what policy is God leading, what of the three is God leading you to? Is God leading you to work on kind of the immediate hunger issues, policy-wise? Is God leading you to the structural issues that get to structural poverty and all of that, which is obviously super important when you're talking about pay differentials that have actually increased over the last 3 years as opposed to decrease. When you're talking about other things that are really systematically connected to structural racism, and thinking about embedding equity in our healthcare system, embedding equity with our housing, affordable housing, like all that stuff. Or is God calling you to work on wealth creation? Because keep in mind that the way that I kind of think about structural racism is really kind of embedded in every single corner, every single facet of our society. So it's not just something that we see that just pops up when we talk about poverty levels. No, it's something that we see when we even think about higher income African Americans who are suffering from health conditions just by virtue of receiving unequal access to care. So we really have to think about all three, and I would just encourage the church to think about, okay, is God calling me to work on the policy? I mean, it's calling this church to work on the policies that can provide racial equity at the immediate kind of hunger level, where people are struggling every single day? Or is he calling me to work at kind of the structural poverty piece? Or is he calling me at the kind of empowerment, wealth building piece? And then in addition, I would challenge you to not only pray for that corporate discernment, but also the individual discernment, right? Because every one of you, every one of us, we're voters. We get to vote for policy. The tax bill, that was policy. And it actually took us a lot of steps back in terms of racial equity. So just think about it when we're thinking about our own policies that we're endorsing, that we're supporting, that we're advocating on behalf of. It's not just about the corporate church, but it's also about our individual faith with God and us being responsive to the calling that He's had for us to care for His children and to also exude that through servant leadership.
I'd like to focus on my comment about banking. Many of us have bank accounts individually, and many of us have banking accounts as churches and as conferences. So the United Methodist Church as a whole holds its money somewhere. Conferences hold their money somewhere, and each of us hold our money somewhere. So one very concrete social justice action that I mentioned earlier was transferring money into Black-owned banks or banks who are owned by people of color. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. One, if we want to start at kind of the reflective level would be, okay, this challenge has gone forward for me to transfer my money from a particular bank to a bank that's owned by people of color. If I have any kind of resistance to that whatsoever, no matter what it is, any kind of hesitation, and maybe I even take the time to take a piece of paper or write on my smartphone, type on my smartphone, the reasons that I'm hesitating, right? And perhaps there's a whole list of those reasons. Then, as Christians, as people of faith, we are called to interrogate all of those reasons, right? Why is it so? Why is it so that I have any hesitation at all to transfer money into an organization that is created and or now, it could be created by, but definitely now has to be led by people of color, right? If there's any hesitation there at all, then there should be a racial justice, racial equity lens, and a racial bias lens that's used to interrogate anything that comes up on that list. So part of it is just a reflective thing, right? Social justice comes when we make particular decisions. And sometimes our decisions are based in racial inequity, injustice, and racial bias. And so those things need to be interrogated. At a currency level, the one that I briefly talked about while I was speaking before has to do with who are we rewarding with our money-generating money. So are we rewarding banks like Wells Fargo and Bank of America and others who have proven over and over and over again to be terrorizing people of color financially? So, often we don't use the language, or at least white folks don't use the language of financial terror when it comes to racism. But each of us could imagine what it would feel like for us to get a bank loan and then find that there's no possible way, even with the grace of God, that we're going to be able to pay for both food and our rent or mortgage. So thinking about who we are rewarding with our banking money. So no matter how small our bank accounts are, they generate money for whatever institution we have hold it for us. So whether that's our banking accounts or whether that's loans that generate interest, our goal should be transferring our money, generating money, into organizations that will build up the power, which leads me to my third point, the power of communities and organizations of color. Because whether the church wants to admit it or not, we have to come to grips with the fact that money moves stuff. Money gets stuff done. Nobody cares what Bill Gates has to say, or the Amazon guy, whatever his name is, okay? Nobody cares what those two folk have to say, other than the fact that they hold so much money that they will move stuff. They move people. They move policy. Who cares that Bill Gates is going to come to a meeting to talk to me about his feelings about something? Only because he holds so much influence because of the money. Now, I'm not saying Bill Gates isn't a great guy. He might be. I don't know him. But his money is the one, it's the thing that's placing him in these high decision, power-making spaces. So if now I'm speaking to my folk, right? Those of us who are white, if we are really serious about equity, then we've got to be serious about who's making the decisions, who gets into the spaces and who's being taken seriously. And one of the quickest ways we can do that is to gather our money together and place it within organizations that are headed and led and controlled by people of color, because then people of color are going to be in the spaces that are making the decisions, and their decisions are going to be taken more seriously. The best thing that we can do with our privilege is to gather it together and offer it, rather than trying to get into leadership positions ourselves. Now, the way white supremacy works, sometimes it's going to be us that has to be in a particular space to be able to speak, but that's not all of the time. And if we're looking for a concrete, quick move of social justice that can make significant difference, it's to transfer our money into organizations that will, are money generating money into organizations that are led and controlled by people of color.
I've been in pastoral ministry for 10 years, and then 10 years prior to that was in lay ministry in one form or another. So 20 years of active ministry. I'm in a season of discernment, figuring out what I'm going to do next. But in that time, one of the things that I would tell my congregants all the time is that every act of, every ministry of, as Reverend Oliver indicated, every ministry of mercy, I say the word charity, is an opportunity for justice. Every ministry of mercy is an opportunity for justice. For example, if you are feeding folks out of a soup kitchen, we should be in tune enough to the presence of God to eventually ask the deeper question: why is it that the same families come to this soup kitchen? That's a justice question. If we have a backpack ministry that feeds kids at a local school, that's a charity. It's good work. It's noble work. It's what we're called to do as Christians. But at some point, packing those bologna sandwiches and those crackers, the Spirit of God is going to speak and ask you, why is it that there are children that go to school hungry in this neighborhood? That's a justice question. Every ministry of charity, mercy, is an opportunity for justice. The question is, do we as the church have the will to move our charity to justice? 1 John 3:17 says it this way: how does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? I really don't like 1 John. Because every time you read it, the epistle writer just slaps you aside the head, just beats you over and over and over again. But it's a condemnation that we who have wealth, that's the condemnation. We who have wealth. It's not a rocket science, the writer says. It just says, if you got it, give it. And help is not just charity, it is justice. And so every church has some way in which they offer charity. That's a good and noble thing. I don't want to belittle those things. But are we asking the why question? The why question moves us from charity to justice. I've served in enough churches and served in enough ministries to know that for the charity event, you'll get, in a congregation of 100 folks, you'll get 10 to show up for the backpack program to feed children, or the soup kitchen. You'll get 10 of that 100 to do that. But when you ask the justice question, you'll have 1. Or 3. But for those of us who are in larger churches, who are more connected, this is the holistic Christianity that we are called to practice. It is not a separation of pulpit and discipleship, or better yet, pulpit and politics. Because Jesus, in the midst of a pulpit moment, uses politics when he turns over tables in the courts of the temple. And so it's only an American Christianity that says we got to separate that. A colleague of mine talks about how we have there's a professor who wrote a book called Bipolar Faith, who kind of coined the term. But prior to that, I had a colleague that would say the phrase, you know, American Christians have a bipolar faith. In that, on one hand, we want all of this good and all this nobility and all of our discipleship to be lived out in this way, but we segregate our faith in all sorts of other ways. It's only in American Christianity that says, my faith is mine. It takes a communal Christian identity, which is a we, and makes it an I. And so what we have to struggle is, we have to struggle against that. And the justice moments are the places and spaces where we actually turn a charitable, which makes us feel good, into a justice, which means we are all made whole. Or justice is grace lived out in the community. And so being able to understand what that looks like for us as Christians, as members of a congregation, as members of a small group ministry, as members of a Sunday school class, that's where the Spirit of God really works. So it doesn't have to be something complicated. It just is, what are we already doing? And I'm looking at this. Why is that happening? That, if you are faithful and courageous, that will take you on a journey towards justice every single time. Now, maybe more than you can handle by yourself, but that's why we're the body of Christ. Some of us have eyes, some of us have hands, some of us have a tongue to speak. Amen.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? Comments? Discussion? Yes.
So sorry, I don't remember speaking over one. In the beginning, when you were talking, you said there was a distinction between where there are public spaces and there are private spaces. Would you speak to the private spaces at all?
Yeah, so I think I heard the question. You said that there is a difference between the level of integration we see with our public spaces and our private spaces, and you wanted me to kind of deconstruct what I meant by that.
Yeah, especially the private spaces. I understood the public spaces, but I didn't understand what you meant by the private spaces.
Yeah, so by the private spaces, I think that there are a ton of different private spaces, but when you think about 50 years ago and the call that we had, the public policy call that we had for integration through a variety of different policies, the response by and large was not necessarily to integrate. The threat was to pull money out in order for public spaces to integrate. And it doesn't necessarily matter like what those public spaces are, because it was kind of for like public spaces in general. But the result was actually the building of a lot of private spaces. So you see a lot of, let's say, like private white schools who that it didn't necessarily. It was masked almost. It was like transitioned from a race issue to then kind of a class issue, because it was just like, okay, well, I'm paying into this and I just want to make sure that my child has a better education, so I'm paying into it, as opposed to a non-paid, presumably and perceivably kind of worse off public education as a result of the integration that it brought, right? You see that also too with just you see that too with the institutions that help to create and sustain neighborhoods. So we're thinking about like different clubs, for example, and that's its own thing, where essentially you pay into the club, or if you live in a particular neighborhood, then you get to have free admission to that club. But in a way, in some privatized way, it is segregated to particular folks, and when you pay into it, then it therefore becomes kind of a justified segregation in a way that for a public space that's not necessarily paid into, it's not justified, because federal law dejustifies it or unjustifies it. you know? So in that sense, we're talking about private spaces like that, but it's also thinking about just our housing policy, right? And when you purchase a house, that then becomes private property, right? And when you purchase a house and you have whole neighborhoods that are essentially operating as if it's a privatized neighborhood, then you have the level of privatization and justified segregation just replicating itself. So, yeah.
I want to dovetail that answer, particularly around the schools question. So in the South, what you find is right after Brown v. Board, and this is the connection that I was speaking to earlier about the complicity of our Christian churches, what you begin to see is the rise of church schools, beginning in the mid-late 70s. Take a state like Florida, for example, which struggled and fought tooth and nail against desegregation. There are churches, I'm particularly thinking of the city of Fort Lauderdale, where there were churches whose, you can go down a particular neighborhood block and you can see the dates of those starting of the church schools coinciding with ordinances to desegregate the public school. So over and over again, you see schools being created. So the parishioners of that church, mostly white, take their children out of the neighborhood school and put them in the church's school as a way of resegregating in a different way, right? Now, I say that, I know that particularly because part of who I work with is our United Methodist pastors from across the country dealing with issues of community engagement. And many of these young clergy persons who are under the age of 40 are working and pastoring churches who are having to struggle with the identity of the church school that was founded to keep segregation alive, which nobody wants to talk about in the church. So now what you have is a church school and a church who's asking for quote unquote missional engagement and opening up the school to the neighborhood without coming to grips with the fact that the church's school was created to not include the neighborhood to begin with. You see right? So that's a tangible example that happens, and happens actually throughout the South. So when we look at our church schools, our nursery schools, and I'm talking about in many of these cases, K through 8, K through 6, K through 5, tag-along schools to the community. These aren't religious schools per se. They are doing mainstream instruction, but they were founded for the purposes of keeping segregation alive in a different format. So that would be an example, a concrete example of what you're talking about. Yeah.
I'd just like to say a quick thing also. For those of us, again, I'm going to talk to my group. For those of us who are white, I would just ask us to take just a beat, just a moment, before we begin in our minds to equate falsely these segregated schools that came out of predominantly or all white churches in order to continue segregation, and the black church schools and HBCUs that were formed, right? This is a false equivalency if we're trying to put these two things together and say that they are functioning in the same way and functioning for the same reason. So this brings us again back to the why question, right? So before we start making that equivalency that's based in a lie, actually, that we racialized lie, we want to make sure that we're asking the why question. Why were the white churches creating schools, and why were the black churches creating schools? Or why were there predominantly white or all white institutions of higher learning, and why are there HBCUs?
Thank you, that's an excellent point. I just want to, Reverend Hooker from South Carolina is watching us, and he is echoing that sentiment, saying that that's what's happening in South Carolina, this segregation by wealth. So that's something we see throughout the South. Yes.
The same people in the South, because I lived in South Carolina and in Georgia, you can tell by my accent. Really and truthfully, the same people who were forming the white schools, segregated schools, were also voting fewer dollars towards education because their children weren't going to those schools. And so is going towards Department of Transportation and Recreation.
I actually really want to speak to that last part because I think even with you saying the large part of money was going to the Department of Transportation, I'm not sure if everyone in the room caught the implications of that, right? So the reason that you see the transition of funding from education to transportation in particular is just as a result of segregation. So when you're thinking about the fact that with integration, a lot of white families were actually, they started to send their children to privatized schools and therefore didn't necessarily feel that need to contribute to the larger tax base that was therefore going to public education. Yeah, we would expect then, just by structure and the design of policy, the decrease of education. But what you wouldn't necessarily expect is the increase of transportation. And this actually comes by way of the way that our federal, by way of our housing segregation and the fact that around the same time this is also happening, white flight was happening. So you have whites leaving the city areas, going to suburban areas, and keep in mind that for a long time, whites and blacks were both living in the cities, but it was just segregated. Now, with transportation, i.e. roads, to therefore allow the access from and the transportation from a suburb, right, just 10 to 20 minutes out then from the city to occur is by way of roads, right? And a lot of the way that the roads in America were subsidized was federally. They were federally subsidized, but then also just kind of looking at the state and the fact that tax dollars went to that to therefore sustain segregation.
Yes.
There was segregation in the north too. I mean, people want to make this a north and south issue, it's a southern issue. And it wasn't. I moved from Arkansas to California when I was in high school. And in the south, we had high school and college school. When we moved to Los Angeles, I found what they had, good schools and bad schools, which were the same, which turned out to be the same thing, in part because people whites moved. They moved from neighborhoods, and as blacks moved in, whites moved out, the schools got bad, and kids had trouble, they had trouble learning. They're still fighting for help. They still have cases in the courts in California about the schools, the inequality in the schools in certain neighborhoods in California. I lived in San Diego. I went to high school. I went to college in San Diego, which had the reputation at the time as the most racist city west of the Mississippi. They did not have a riot in San Diego 50 years ago when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, because someone who was really active with the civil rights movement in San Diego told me, he said there'll never be a riot in San Diego because of the suicide. I went to a policy meeting one time with one of the class projects. Someone from the city council was there, someone from the police department was there, and they said they can account for 93% of all the blacks in San Diego live in one area of town, and his comment was, we know where the other 7% are. So the fact that they actually had a riot in some cities
Thank you, and just want to reiterate the comment that exposes the fact that this exists beyond the South. When we see this type of segregation happening in the West, in California, as well as in the North. Yes.
I just kind of wanted to piggyback some of my observations currently right now on education policy, because I'm a public school educator. I'm hearing different patterns of investing in different patterns, propagated in the South and different things, going from public school investment to private school investment. With what I'm up to date with on our current national policies, I'm seeing the same trends shifting
to private sectors. And I work in a high-need school. I already know what that's going to do based on where my school is, where I currently teach. What happens when we get that at a national level? We're 50 years ahead of where we were, but oh my goodness, what happens if we make that shift back? And now we're going to do it at a national level? I'm sorry, but that has to be spoken.
So part of what we at Wesley do is we have initiatives that are designed to turn the church inside out. That's what we call it. So that we get uncomfortable with sitting in our pews inside the church, and we actually begin to move out. And one of the things that we say, particularly with the group of pastors I work with nationally, is that if you want to know what is at stake in your community right now, walk into your local public school. There's one right down the street, right? Just down the road here. There's a public school, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
And mine's the next one.
And yours is next one.
Mine is the next one.
Right. So from Arlington to here, I think I passed 3 or 4 public schools on Columbia Pike, right? So when we first started having these conversations with pastors, the amount of pastors that had no idea the proximity of their church to the local school, what we discovered is that most churches share a zip code with at least 3 public schools on average. But there's rarely any contact between the two. But if you want to know what the economic environment is in your neighborhood, all you need to do is find the statistics for that school. It'll tell you the number of students who are free and reduced lunch. It'll tell you the number of whether the school is a Title I, Title IV, Title III school. It'll tell you all you need to know about your immediate neighborhood. And then talk to the principal. What I have found in speaking to principals is that principals are like pastors for their community.
That's right, sir.
And so when you talk to I've spoken to pastors who have negotiated gang truces in their neighborhood and said the playground is not a recruiting place. And they can agree with that. The gang members can agree with that because my little cousin goes to school too, so I don't want any gang violence there because my cousin goes there. There's a community in Gaithersburg, Maryland. It's a retirement community. It's a Methodist retirement community. It's called Asbury United Methodist Village. Some of you may know about it. It's a lot of folks there. It's very wealthy. You buy into it, but it has a missional arm to it called the Beloved Community. And if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to Google it, research it. It's called the Beloved Community Initiative of Gaithersburg. And it's housed at Asbury United Methodist Village. Here you have 80, 90, and 100-year-old retired persons going into the South Lake and Gaithersburg elementary schools doing enrichment. And what they're saying is the national policy is always going to be what it is. And we will do our best to vote with our feet, but doggone it, every single day there are kids coming here hungry. And it's my Christian duty to make sure that that ought not happen. Not in my zip code. And I think part of what we have to do as the church is to be able to fight in a way that we can exercise our faithful responsibilities, but also be clear that we are living a democracy and we can fight in other ways as well. And so we can shape the national policy, and we should in whatever way that our faith informs us, but there are also some basic things, no matter who is in office, that need to be done, right? So private schools, you don't really need to worry about necessarily feeding those children because they tend to come with lunch and other resources already provided to them. But what's going on in my public school? When the folks at Asbury got involved, they discovered that the local neighborhood apartment building where about 90% of the kids came from was a slum. And the tenants didn't want to do anything about it because most of them were undocumented. So they just lived in a slum. So they didn't have any voting power, they didn't have any way to shape policy. But here you have 1,500 retired elderly persons who have nothing else to do all day but to write letters, and you know, every politician that was coming up for election in Montgomery County would make their way through Asbury United Methodist Village. Well, guess what? The day that they started asking, what are you going to do about that swamp building over there? So now, I understand that as recently as last month, Asbury led the community to push HUD under the current administration to buy the building under existing federal law and rehabilitate it and turn it into a public facility, which would then, all the public rules would go into effect, right? So there you have a Christian community mobilizing to make something happen, all because they got started by working in the school. And I think that's the real rub for us as Christians. We think we got to change the world by doing all this other kind of stuff. If you just put your hand to the plow that's in front of you and continue to discern what God is doing in the midst and allow the Spirit to lead you to the next thing and the next thing, then you're doing the work of justice.
So one of the things that I was thinking about is that during the 2016 presidential election season, there were many people who were part of voting campaigns who came back to the organizers and said, you know, we just can't get people interested in voting. You know, they're saying things like, I don't like any of the presidential candidates, my one vote isn't going to make a difference, all those kinds of things. And one of the strategies that some local and national DC organizers were sharing was that actually when you tell people that your local district attorney gets voted in by sometimes less than 150 votes, then you can get people's attention. So people who are really interested in criminal justice, when you let them know exactly the work that the district attorney does and the decisions that the district attorney gets to make, and how that affects the criminal justice system, and then you let them know that they can be outvoted by even 150 people, then it lets folks see their vote more powerfully than they saw it before. And I'm thinking that while obviously we need to be paying attention to national agendas and who's being you know, entered into these secretary spots and things like that, we also want to take seriously school boards. Because school boards hold a huge amount of power and are often making decisions without any challenge whatsoever. And you can get, I mean, even if you sent 10 people from one coalition to a school board meeting, that's going to seem huge. But if you send 50, and if you send people who represent voting blocks, and you can let those folks know these are the voting blocks that we represent, that makes a change really fast. Because now they realize that they're not making these decisions without any kind of accountability or challenge. So I'm just saying, as we look at the national, to also look very specifically at local policy and who are the decision makers and what is the level of momentum that it takes to tip the scales.
And I guess I could just close on that because it really goes back to what I mentioned a little ways back, which is applying a racial equity lens, right? Like it's so important to do that for everything we do. And to your original comment on the fact that, you know, you're a public school teacher teaching in a lower income, lower wealth school, we have to think about, okay, well, what are the implications? There's a few questions that we can ask, like when we want to apply a racial equity lens. What is the policy and who is it going to impact the most? That's like one of the most basic things. When we see that it's going to disproportionately impact communities of color, then it's it's pretty clear then that a racial equity lens needs to be applied, since clearly it's a lot of systemic racial inequity, you know, that has actually created the condition in which we see, and that's why we're saying that communities of color are more disproportionately impacted. I think the second question to that is how are they impacted, and who is already doing the work, right? Because when you're building out a strategy, it's important, I think, for us not to reinforce paternalism, right? Like, oh, this is something that I just realized is like an issue, so I should just go out and start doing stuff on it. And it's great, and it's a pure heart, but I think it needs to be kind of checked with consciousness in a way that allows us to kind of recognize the point that we're coming at it with, because a lot of folks are probably already working on it. So I know when I was with the NAACP, something that we did was, like regularly, was community mapping, you know, mapping out, okay, this is an issue. And even though, like, obviously I'm a person of color, I also had to check my own privilege because I'm not originally from DC, right? I'm originally from California. So even in that, I had to check my privilege and say, okay, I'm coming into a community who they've lived it and I haven't. Now, if we're talking about LA, I can talk about that and I can have agency with that. But clearly, we're on another space. So the issue of privilege obviously comes not only if you're not from an area, but then also looking at your class background and then also your racial background. So with that, doing power mapping I think is huge because you're able to identify the players who are already working on this issue. And then, especially if it looks at if it's an issue and all issues need racial equity, I think it's about partnering with the leaders, empowering them, and being in a place of learning, and not just coming to them and saying, okay, I know this is such an issue, this is what I think should happen. It's like, no, what are you all doing? How can I partner with you? How can I be an ally? Because that's a lot different than the paternalistic approach. And then I think in terms of just like with that partnership, then facilitating kind of, okay, well, how does racial equity look in terms of the actual policy, right? Clearly we know that there have been attacks on public education, but that's only been the case once blacks have been integrated and once Latinos and Native Americans are integrated into the public education system. So because of that, we know that it's important to preserve and strengthen our public education system because we know that people of color and students of color are at higher rates sending their children to those schools just by virtue of not necessarily having the wealth to send them off to private schools. So because of that, we have to preserve at the very baseline and strengthen the funding for public education system. And that's one of the ways that we can think about racial equity for education is how do you preserve and how do you strengthen funding for, and how do you fight back funding cuts against public education?
Thank you. We're at towards the end of my time, but I will take one more question that you have.
No, I just wanted to ask this question. How many of you in here are Fairfax County residents? Okay, what I would want to offer to you as they lift these plans of action for you is that the county recently passed a policy of equity that was passed by both the Board of Supervisors and Fairfax County Public Schools. And they are now at that existential moment of trying to figure out how this equity lens applies to all the things county. So let me ask you to go to the county webpage and look up one Fairfax. Everybody write yourself. You should be writing right now. One Fairfax. Look up one Fairfax. And I want you to continue to monitor what that means. One of the sad things for me as I look at transition is that I have been part of that initial work. I am sad that I won't be able to ride that pony to the finish line. But what I want to do is create an atmosphere of understanding and expectation. Because here's where these conversations typically fail. You hear from the choir. How many of you know today we've been preaching to the choir? I didn't see nobody get up and start hollering like their hair was on fire when they started talking about stuff. Especially my sister from another mister who talks to people who are Caucasian. Many times we get up and run like our hair is on fire because I heard something that deeply offends me. But I'm glad that you all ain't done that. So it is really incumbent upon that community to take a look at what is proposed so that we can have a voice in what will transpire. It's in its infancy. I think it has great potential. I think that it can be a driver for change here, especially in the public schools, but more so about health, more so about economic distribution, more so about investments in communities of color. And so that's all I have to say about that.
So I'll repeat a little bit of that Fairfax County has instituted a racial equity lens with which to view various policies and decisions that they make. And that might be a big takeaway from our panel, that, whether going to your local city council, wherever you are, for those who are not here and watching on Facebook, whether participating in your local school board, whether considering policy on a local, state, or national level, and whether to consider what you do in ministry. What are the racial equity implications of this? How does this impact people differently based on where they're situated? Does this continue further inequalities, or can this policy, or how can this be reframed or reshaped in a manner that leads more toward justice? We are at the end of our time today. I want to once again thank all of our panelists. And all of you for attending and participating, as well as those online. This video will be available again on our Facebook page as well as on our website for you to view. And I'll also just put in a plug for the racial wealth gap simulation that Marlysa led here at Annandale UMC not too long ago. I believe that will be available online soon as well, and we'll post a link to that when it is. Thank you.